Okay, so the topic of my talk is the self as witness. And as a lot of you know, I've been working for the last couple of years looking in great detail at the famous Satipatthana Sutta, which is the primary discourse of the Buddha on contemplative practice. It's often called the foundations of mindfulness. It is really underlies the Vipassana tradition or insight meditation practice. In general, what I've discovered is that the Satipatthana Sutta is a way of verifying the Dhamma in actual experience. And one thing that needs to be appreciated is that the Buddha was really not a philosopher. He did not teach, except on rare occasions, in very abstract terms. All of his teachings are concrete. What makes them complex is that we are not used to thinking or experiencing the world in such a concrete way. We experience the world through a fog of presumptions about the world. So the Buddha, when you practice Satipatthana, which is a meditative practice, the idea is that to have a good idea of what the Dhamma is that the Buddha is teaching, and a good idea of what the observables are in actual experience, that can verify those teachings. You combine them together and practice them together. The most difficult teaching, I think, of the Buddha, people really have a trouble grasping, is the teaching of non-self. Now, non-self is the primary focus of the Satipatthana Sutta. People don't realize that because it doesn't really mention non-self, but it's very clear when you look at it very closely that the whole sutta is organized around the teaching of non-self. Now, non-self is an unusual teaching because you cannot experience non-self directly. And the reason is that it's a negative. You can fail to experience the self, but you cannot experience non-self. So there is kind of a roundabout teaching in terms of a series of thought experiments that the Buddha presents as exercises to study non-self. Now, the Buddha considers three facets of the self. The self is something we presume but do not experience directly. It is a very strong presumption, and it characterizes and influences our life very profoundly. Our lives are basically based on a sense of self. And the Buddha says that's mistaken, and it gets us into a lot of trouble. It causes a lot of suffering. In order to become selfless, we have to deconstruct that self, that presumption, take it apart. Now, it's not enough to take it apart as theoretically, which we can do. There are a lot of arguments to explain why there's no self, philosophical arguments, but those don't reach far enough. We have to actually experience non-self, which is something we can't really experience, but we have to go to the experiential level. Otherwise, it won't make a difference in our life. So you think of quantum scientists. They live, in a sense, in a world of these quantum objects of various kind, and collapsing probability functions and things. But when they go home, they don't look at their wife and their kids and see quantum objects or collapsing probability functions because it's not internalized. It's kept at a philosophical distance. It does not do us any good to learn the Buddha's teachings if it keeps us at a philosophical distance. We have to experience these teachings directly. So the Buddha taught that there are three aspects, there are three facets to the self. There's the body self, there's the mind self, and there's the witness self. And he treats these as independent categories as the first, second, and third satipatthana. The fourth satipatthana is an open category in which you can look at any of the teachings that can potentially be verified in experience and are not always concerned with the self. So the body self makes sense to people. I can move. I can. I have body parts. I can assume different postures. Therefore, I am a body. This is the reasoning behind the presumption. I have thoughts. I have emotions. Therefore, I am a mind. The witness self is I observe, I see, I hear. Therefore, I am a witness. This is the basic idea of the three selves. Now, I want to look at the witness self because this is actually the hardest to deconstruct. And in a lot of subsequent teachings, a lot of teachings after the Buddha, the witness self is often ignored. There's a very famous sutta. It's very short, but it's a wonderful sutta. I'll quote part of it. That has to do with the idea of the self as witness, or the teaching of non-self. This sutta has the bhikkhuni, the awakened nun, Vajra, sitting there in meditation. And who should approach but Mara? Mara is kind of a demon that shows up in a lot of the discourses of the Buddha in order to add a little color. And Mara, his mission in life is to distract people from Buddhist practice. He appears in the story of the Buddha as this demon that tries to, when the Buddha, when the Bodhisattva, the Buddha to be, sits down under the Bodhi tree, he's distracted by Mara. This story of Mara trying to distract the Buddha from his awakening is not in the earliest texts. It's a later embellishment, but there's Mara. Mara does appear in the early texts. So anyway, Mara approaches Vajra, and he says in verse, "By whom has this being been created? Where is the maker of the being? Where has the being arisen? Where does the being cease?" So the being is the self. He's not aware that Vajra is fully awakened and is a teacher in her own right at the time of the Buddha. And so she has a quick comeback. So Mara is just trying to confuse her with the most difficult question of Dharma. Okay, and here is Vajra's answer. "Why now do you assume a being? Mara, is that your speculative view, your presumption? This is a heap of sheer formations. There is no being to be found. Just as with an assemblage of parts, the word chariot is used, so when the aggregates exist, there is the convention of a being. It's only suffering that comes to be, suffering that stands and falls away. Nothing but suffering comes to be nothing but suffering ceases. Okay, she makes a reference here to the chariot consisting of parts and the being consisting of aggregates. The aggregates is a very, very important teaching of the Buddha. It's all over the place in the early suttas. They're sometimes called the aggregates of clinging or the aggregates of attachment. I call them the appropriation aggregates because clinging or attachment is based on the idea, it is the experience of identifying something as me or mine. And appropriation gets across that word. Okay, so she says we're just a bunch of aggregates. Aggregate means just a heap of anything. The word in Pali is kanda, and it just is an unordered heap of anything. It can be sugar or rice or firewood, but the human is just a bundle, five bundles, five heaps of aggregates. Okay, what are the aggregates? The aggregates are form, and form refers to appearances that appear in the sense fields. Form is specific to vision, but it's used for all of the sense fields. It is just basically shapes and colors that might appear in your visual field, sounds that appear in your ear, and so on. That's form. By the way, I sent to the chat a list of the appropriation aggregates: form, feeling, perception, fabrications, and cognizance. Feeling is the experience of something as interesting. Normally, it's the experience of something as pleasant or painful. But there is a third category, which is neither pleasant nor painful, which we can think of as we just find something interesting. We're curious about it. It evokes our curiosity. We want to explore it. So this is feeling. Perception is recognition. You can think of when you look at your visual field, it's just shapes and colors, but no objects. But immediately objects start popping up in your visual field. You see faces, you see objects like tables or your computer screen. These are perceptions. In human experience, they pop up immediately, almost out of nowhere, with no thought. They're effortless, although they're cognitively very complex. Fabrications are things that require the thinking mind, that are inferences about the mind. We see relationships, we see wholes and parts, and they're the basic building blocks of the reality that we construct and think is real. And then cognizance it's a word often translated as consciousness. It is the whole thing. We have the experience of being in the middle of a fully fleshed out reality. But this reality has to be constructed in our mind for reasons that you can explore philosophically. It has to be created in our mind. It may or may not correspond to something out there. It probably doesn't correspond very closely to what's actually in the world out there. But we experience it as the world out there, fully fleshed out, three-dimensional, full of things that we do not experience directly. So we have the aggregates as these 5 aggregates. Now, the most common interpretation of what the Vajra is saying here. This little sutta has a huge influence on subsequent Buddhist thought. It's referred to a lot, but people look at the sutta. He says the aggregates: form, feeling, perception, fabrications, and cognizance. They're there, and we assume that they are, when you bring them together, they are a self. But Vajra says that's just a conventional way of talking. There's no self there. So the normal interpretation is what she's talking about. What are the components of a self? And the normal interpretation is, oh, the self is body and mind. You bring the body and mind together, and you think you have a self. You presume a self once there's a body and mind. The body is form, and then the other four aggregates are mind. So form is something physical. Feeling, perception, fabrications, and cognizance are mental. This is the standard interpretation that you find in the Theravada tradition, certainly, although not everybody agrees with it. So you have body and mind. There are some problems with this interpretation. One is form doesn't mean body. It means your visual fields, meaning you're looking outward from the self to the world out there. This is what it means. It's an ancient word. It's found in pre-Buddhist teachings. Rupa does not mean body, and yet the assumption is that it means body. So we account for the body self. Remember the three facets of self. And then the other ones, well, they do appear to be mental: feeling, perception, fabrications, and cognizance. So they account for the mind self. They do not account for the witness self. So that's another issue with this interpretation. Another issue is, what do you do with this teaching? Can you take the teaching and look at feeling or perception and think, oh, perception is a component of the self? The perception would seem to be kind of an abstraction. Can you observe perception? The implication is that just as you put a chariot together from its parts, you have 5 parts, and you construct the self out of these 5 parts. So perception, for instance, would be something abstract, something like a human faculty of mind. However, remember, these are aggregates. Perception is not a faculty of mind. It's an unordered collection of something. So what are these? What is the thing? What are the observables here that we could, for instance, observe in meditation? What are these observables that we're collecting into five heaps? This is the question from the meditator's point of view. Well, the answer is quite easy. When you look at these 5 factors, all of them have something very much in common. Each one is a form of awareness. Form, the first one, is a form of unordered awareness, one unanalyzed awareness. It's basically your visual field. Pixels or shapes and colors, for instance, is form, and there's awareness going on. Feeling is a form of awareness. So we're aware of something as either painful or pleasant or something else. Perception is a form of awareness. You see a friend, you recognize their face, pop, you have the perception. Uh, Fabrications are a form of perception based on inference. In fact, the self would be a kind of fabrication. We do experience a self, even though we cannot observe it directly. We think it's there. So this is actually itself a form of awareness. What we're aware of doesn't have to actually exist. And cognizance is a form of awareness. So these are all forms of awareness. And each one's a heap because awareness always comes in the form of an observable momentary experience. We observe one thing, we observe something else. The mind is jumping around. The eyes are jumping around from one thing to another. So awareness is something short-lived. But there are many, many instances of awareness. We're sitting in the middle of a stream of awareness. So this accounts for the 5 aggregates, the 5 heaps. They're awareness events, 5 heaps of awareness events. This explains what these aggregates are and what they all have in common. If we were to take feeling, perception, fabrications, and cognizance as mind, we could substitute that with all kinds of things. Like we could say mind is divided into 2 parts, thoughts and emotions. Different ways of dividing up the mind, but we get these 4 for the mind. They're all mind, and they're all not mind. An awareness event is always a dual event. It's a dualism. There is awareness itself, which is a mental event. But when there's awareness, it's awareness of something outside of the self. And mostly it's awareness of the world out there, whether it's fabricated or what we fabricate reflects reality. Our awareness events are of the world out there. So let's look at a different interpretation, and this is what Bhikkhuni Vajira must have had in mind. She doesn't have in mind body and mind. She has in mind the witness self. So every awareness event is an example of witnessing. We could talk about awareness events in general, but actually the way we experience the world, we usually experience it not aware that there's an awareness event going on. We just think we show up and the world's right there. This is normal. But the Buddha, in teaching the 5 aggregates, says, every time you're aware of something, tell me in what way you are aware of it. And there are 5 choices: form, feeling, perception, fabrications, and cognizance. And if you're forced to say what the form of awareness is, then you're aware that there's an awareness event, a mental awareness event, as well as the world out there impinging on us. We're aware of things in the world out there. So the aggregates actually have a dual function. They describe witnessing or awareness, but they also describe the world out there that we fabricate mentally. So this underlies this. So what Vajira is saying, she's actually not describing body and mind. She's describing the witness self. The witness self is composed, we presume a witness self because we have awareness events. Basically, the logic that underlies the presumption is if I see something, there must be a seer, and that seer is me. It's a self. If I'm aware of something, there must be someone to be aware of something. If I am observe something, there must be an observer. If I perceive something, there must be a perceiver. If I feel something, there must be a feeler. If I fabricate something, there must be a fabricator. This seems common sense. This is why non-self is such a difficult thing to grasp, is the logic seems impeccable. Even Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. If there's a thinker, there must be, if there's thinking going on, there must be a thinker. The Buddha says, no, that doesn't follow logically at all. So for instance, if it's raining, is there a rainer? So the Buddha is always trying to bring us to the point where our experience is depersonalized. We don't insert a self into it. There is just dependent co-arising. Things arise contingently on other things in our experience, and forget the self, because the self just confuses us and gets us in a lot of trouble. So this is the basis of this interpretation that Vajra so skillfully brought to us, but it was largely misinterpreted, I'm claiming, as trying to combine the body mind and the body self and the mind self into this sense of self, and leaving out the facet, which is actually the hardest self to deconstruct, which is the witness self. But it's entirely about the witness self, and that's what the aggregates are serving here. Okay, so just to conclude, when Mara tried to confuse Vajra, not realizing that it would be hopeless, he chose his verse well. He chose his topic well, because this idea of non-self is almost, it's the hardest thing to grasp. People have a lot of trouble with it. But we can grasp it intellectually in Buddhist practice by reading the suttas, or by, there are all kinds of explanations that challenge the idea, philosophical explanations. But ultimately, we have to see it in the stillness of meditation. And in the stillness of meditation, we can clearly experience the aggregates and yet not experience the presumption of a self, meaning one does not entail the other. Okay. Any questions? I have chat open, so you can put a question on chat. Well, a lot of people. How many people are sitting in the hall there?
Mitch, you're muted.
Yeah, we have 11 people in person here.
11 people. Okay.
25 Zoom this week.
Okay, probably the numbers will increase to their former level, or maybe people prefer to sit at home. You should get you should set up, just take somebody's cell phone or something and set it up so that the people at home and me can see the audience. It'd be nice to see the group there. It'd be like the old days for me.
Bhikkhu Cintita.
Yes.
You mentioned body as being, did you say rupa or arupa, like matter or non-matter for body?
Rupa.
Okay,
Matter.
thank you.
Yeah. So the
appreciate it.
idea is rupa is matter. What you see with your eyes, certainly seems to be physical. The thing is, all five of these aggregates involve both physical and mental. They are not distinguished because you have a sense that in your visual field is very physical, and yet your awareness of it is mental. But you can say that about any of the other aggregates. So your awareness, your perception of something is itself mental, but what you're aware of or what you perceive is physical. It might be your friend or your dog or your computer. And so the idea of mental and physical does not separate one aggregate from another. What they have in common is they are a duality of both. And
Okay,
because
thank you.
this is a very, very basic duality that's built into perception or into awareness, and we mistake it for a self and other.
So, Bhante.
Yes, Judy.
Okay, so interesting topic. I never thought of the Satipatthana as a practice of non-self. So when we meditating, how do we put it into practice? How do we? I mean, exactly how we supposed to practice to.
Okay, so in
and
general, the Satipatthana, as I understand it, is a way of verifying and internalizing the Dhamma. So when you sit down to meditate, you're always practicing a particular exercise. That exercise is based on some theme of Dhamma. Oh, there's the group there sitting there in the corner. So you have to have two things in mind. You've got a little task to do. This is not one-pointed meditation. And that is to investigate your own experience in terms of the Dhamma, or investigate the Dhamma in terms of your own experience. It's a matter of bringing them together. So, for instance, the Buddha talked about craving and the Buddha talked about suffering. We can experience craving and suffering directly. We actually need a little bit of training. It's really to understand the semantics. What in our experience is what the Buddha thinks is suffering, and what in our experience is what the Buddha thinks is craving, because we can be very confused about that. Often we think we're having fun, and we think that's pleasure, not suffering. But then we learn to train our minds more closely, and we see that having fun is a lot more suffering than it is pleasure. There's a lot of anxiety, a lot of social pressure, a lot of things like that in fun, and because we're so mindless, most of us, we don't even we don't even really take the time to experience the pleasure that actually arises in having fun. So one of the ideas is to completely understand what the Buddha is talking about in terms of experience, because we will not know what the Buddha is talking about until we start looking at our own experience and pinning it down. And then we will, as we compare our experience with the Dhamma, Buddha talks all about craving, suffering, in the aggregates. We have little bits of insight. We see an experience, we say, oh, I get it. That's what the Buddha was talking about. These are these moments of insight that help us pinpoint what exactly the Dhamma is. So what we're doing is actually comparing experience and Dhamma. Otherwise, Dhamma looks like a philosophical system, and that does us no good. The Dhamma is there only to support practice entirely. Practice of developing wisdom and the practice of developing virtue. And so that's in brief what the practice looks like. Now, as I said, the practice of understanding non-self is kind of a specialized practice because we cannot experience non-self the way we experience craving and suffering, or the aggregates, which are reduced. And so we always are sitting, we can take this practice off the cushion, and sometimes we have to for some aspects of the practice. And there are just many opportunities to experience new things that we're not likely to experience on the cushion, like ill will. If we want to investigate ill will, wait for it to come up in our life and then stop for a while and think, so non-self is touched when you, for those familiar with the Satipatthana Sutta, one of the most confusing things about it is when the Satipatthana Sutta talks about contemplating internally, contemplating externally, and contemplating both internally and externally. Contemplating internally is to look at what in your experience are you basing the presumption of a self on? What is it you're confusing with the self? So one of the exercises, the very first one, is very simple. The breath. The breath is evidence that there is a body self. If there's breathing going on, there must be someone who's breathing. But the Buddha says that's wrong. There is no body self. There's just breathing. And so we sit with our experience is the breathing. But rather than we experience the breathing, breathing is not a teaching of the Buddha, but it's part of this thought experiment that the Buddha sets up. When we completely absorb ourselves in breathing, then we raise the question, where's the self here? Okay, bringing the self to mind is contemplating externally. It's also contemplating the internally is contemplating the body in the body. Body in the body is contemplating what we take as a bodily experience, like breath, but we presume it's in a larger body, which is the body self. So this is the basis of these. This is a very specialized practice within the Satipatthana Sutta, and it's really targeted at understanding non-self. By the way, I've been writing a lot of papers on the Satipatthana Sutta, but they are very academic papers. They're arguing against alternative views and providing an analysis and looking at what the original Pali actually says. But at the same time, lately I've been giving a series of talks on my Friday podcast, which you should be aware of, and on the subject, and I'm beginning to write up a meditation manual that leaves the academics out, but just goes through all of the exercises and the basic introduction to Satipatthana, and then takes up every exercise. Every time you sit down to do one of these exercises, you have to know what your Dhamma is, and you have to know what your observables are well enough that you can begin to compare the two. Your sense of what the Dhamma is will change by seeing them in terms of the observables, and your sense of what the observables are will change by seeing them in terms of the Dhamma. But each one basically takes Dhamma and observables, brings them together in a single practice. So anyway, I'll make this available when I've pounded it into good enough shape. I've already promised Bruce that he'll be the first one to see it when it's in a readable form, the manual.
All right, thank you.
He's my first disciple who's trying out. I call it Satipatthana rethought. This meditation based on my serious interpretation, reinterpretation, serious looking at this teaching.
So we have a question in the chat. I don't know if you saw that.
Okay.
Anything wrong? Basic
Our
understanding.
perception is superficial reality, and awareness or mindfulness teaches us the ultimate reality. The Buddha never talks about ultimate reality. It's an Abhidhamma notion. I think for the Buddha, it's conventional reality all the way down. Everything is fabricated. So the Abhidhamma will tell us about ultimate reality, such as the elements, earth, water, fire, and air are ultimate reality. Suffering is ultimate reality, because these are terms that the Buddha uses. But for the Buddha, our concepts really never quite reach reality. That's why it's important to look at our observables, look at direct experience, and do that a lot. But the Dhamma gives us guidance about what we're looking at in conceptual terms. But we need to bring that, the result of, when I talk about internalizing the Dhamma, what happens to the Dhamma when we sit with it a lot and experience and practice these exercises over and over is that it becomes internalized. So it becomes a matter of intuition, automatically the way we look at the world. This sounds very mystical, but this is the way all of human learning of skills works. It used to be when you were learning to drive, you understood driving in conceptual terms. And it was very, very hard. When you drive now, you don't even have to think about it. Your body knows what to do until something unusual happens, like a goose in the road or something. Then you'll bring the thinking mind. But that's why you can drive and talk on the phone, drink your Starbucks, all of these things at the same time, because driving is effortless. It's all intuitive until there's an emergency. Then the thinking mind will figure out what's going on. Unless you're texting, in which your thinking mind is already in the texting. So this is a natural process. By the way, samadhi is absolutely an essential part of this. We have to be able to still the mind. If we still the mind enough, we cannot even experience the self. So we experience the self. The witness self is something we don't experience as something very substantial, but we just have the sense that it's always there. When I'm looking around, there's that witness self over my shoulder, seeing what I see. Is kind of the sense. It's very abstract, but it'll disappear if you get your mind settled enough into samadhi. You have to go past the first jhana.
Any
If
other-
anybody is interested in practicing satipatthana rethought, people have various kinds of skills. They won't match up with satipatthana rethought, but all the components will be there. The whatever meditation people are doing, it is pointing you in the right direction. I think of satipatthana rethought as actually it's a brilliantly system, lays everything out, but it incorporates everything else. You can like leave off components of the system. You can have samatha meditation would fall into that because you already have the samadhi, but you can leave off the contemplative practice, the investigation of a particular dhamma, and sit there as happy as can be in samadhi, which is worth doing in itself because samadhi itself is a kind of skill that we habituate. That becomes automatic for experienced meditators. That you enter meditative states very quickly.